بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه المنتجبين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. I'm honored indeed for having opportunity to share with you my 2 cents on the relation between freedom of speech on one hand and hate speech on the other. It is, of course, good to be the last presenter and speaker in such a beautiful event. But to be honest, it's not easy to can share anything else after great scholars, researchers before me shared their invaluable thoughts and points and discussed deeply with one another. However, I will do my best to shed a bit light on the concept of hate speech from an Islamic point of view. As we all know, freedom in Islamic thought as well as in human rights is a general title. It covers a variety of examples and instances and the laws and regulations of different examples might be different. We have freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of participation, freedom of association, and so on. And of course, the focus will be on freedom of speech. Again, we all know that the concept of freedom is general. Indeed, freedom and liberty are something like a big family name for a spectrum of different sorts of rights and freedoms, but it is not of categorical rights, as Professor Dr. Sayyid Fatemi in his informative presentation mentioned. It is not of categorical values and or virtues or rights. According to some documents in human rights itself, it can be qualified to the freedom of others, to the just requirement of morality, the public order, and general welfare of the society. So it is capable of accepting qualification, not only in Islam, as I will explain, but also in the framework of human rights itself. I would appreciate it, Ali Reza, if you give me a second to be able to have access to my slides and presentation in a better way. Give me just a few seconds, please. Freedom and liberty, despite their differences, have a high rank in the whole system of human rights. In the Preamble of International Declaration of Human Rights, we read, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So looking at this short paragraph, we realize that in human rights we have something like two fundamental bases, and they are inherent dignity of man and equality of mankind. But there are only a foundations for reaching to freedom, justice, and peace. So from this point of view, we can say that freedom is of actually the ideals and goals and objectives of human rights. In the continuity of this preamble and in the next paragraph, again, the content insists different aspects of freedom, which are freedom of speech, belief, and freedom from fear, which in their turn are very, very important. Let us talk a bit about some concepts in Islamic thoughts which seems to be closely related to the concept of freedom. Of them is the concept of hurriya itself. We have a variety of texts insisting the significance and importance of hurriya. Of course, this progressive concept sometimes is misunderstood and just limited and reduced to hurriya in the sense, in a moralistic sense, meaning being free from bad desires, bad trends, bad belongings, and so on. While if we look at the related texts, we realize that being free from both internal and external obstacles and belongings are meant and intended indeed. Another concept which helps us understand the significance and the place and the ranking of freedom in Islamic thought and value system is the role of freedom and liberty in truth discovery. We all are quite sure that Islamic philosophy often insists the significance of truth, and that in terms of epistemology, cosmology, anthropology, and understanding the nature of man itself, social issues and affairs, perfection, growth, and so on, the issue of truth is very important. And then this is like a cobra or major premise of a deduction. And the minor premise or sohra is that we all know that it is freedom can help us understand truth and realities through discourse, through dialogue in the sense of exchange of information, and discourse in the sense of exchange of argumentation. We can realize truth in many aspects of our life. Another related concept is the fact that we are obliged and at the same time have right to develop truth and good. Often this issue is manifested in the concept of al-amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, as it was discussed in many presentations before me. Also, the concept of self-determination, which is manifested in two golden rules, the rule of domination or asalatu sulta, and nas musallatuna ala anfusihim, people are dominant upon themselves. And another rule, which is asalat adamul wilaya, the rule of non-authority over others. Indeed, these two rules are complementary to each other. And we can also, due to the fact that Islam often insists morality, we can realize that it is free action and freely behaving which deserve moral advantage. So it is far from reality to say that freedom is not an action, and jurists are simply dealing with, action. No, acting freely is the very qualification of action, and this qualification in many occasions gives the action the color and the shape and the sense of morality. And then let us talk a bit about the situation of hate speech in human rights. As I have mentioned here, many human rights instruments and documents prohibit indeed hate speech, and as I will discuss later, even in some cases human rights documents require state to criminalize some examples of hate speech. And in this regard, we have the concept of hate crime. Of course, hate speech is not defined yet in the literature of human rights, even though in every single dictionary or in some writings of human rights, you can find some lights on this concept. Here I tried to learn from Declaration of Ministers of European Union when they define hate speech as a concept which covers all forms of expressions that spread, incite, promote, or justify racial hatred, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, or other forms of hatred based on intolerance. The point here is that, as I will discuss and elaborate more later, there is a relationship between, tolerance or intolerance on one hand and hate speech on the other. Major controversies over hate speech. There are some major controversies over hate speech in the literature of human rights. First, which is more important, which is probably more important, is that it is not clear to what extent it can qualify freedom of speech. It is a matter of ambiguity, as it is probably the very nature and requirement of these sorts of concepts. Then its boundary with criticism in general and scholarly criticism is not clear in particular. Dr. Boujani, in his wonderful presentation, tried to shed a light on distinguishing between freedom, of course, to clarify the boundaries between freedom of speech and scholarly criticism. Then probably another important controversy and debate is that the decider about what is hate speech is not clear. As we know, the hate speech has some objective and subjective aspects. One may, speak in a particular way with a particular intention. Objectively, one may infer that this is one example of hate speech, but it doesn't any means real. So to decide about this case is not often easy. And of course, criminalization of hate speech is again of controversial issues, because as we know, in criminalization, we use the strongest sort and method of prohibition against, one behavior and or action. And indeed, we want to limit and confine someone, or confine and prohibit some behaviors for the promotion of a supposedly humane and human rights, concept, which is something like tolerance, moderation, and so on. Generally speaking, I'm in favor of possibility of making hate speech as the qualification of freedom of speech. Here I rely upon basically some concepts. Of them is, no harm principle, due to the fact that hate speech has its own psychological, and mental, harm. Again, Dr. Boujani pointed out to some aspects of this question. Plurality of values in Islamic value system. From the time of the Plato up to now, we have learned from not only philosophers and scholars and thinkers, but also from our Prophet and our infallible Imams, that liberty and freedom is not the only supportable and defendable value. It is our responsibility to put together all values in a consistent, effective, and compatible way. This is very important. A Muslim hardly can be a liberal or a libertarian in the sense of supporting just freedom and liberty and leaving aside other values and or virtues. In Islam, again, we know that humane communication is often insisted, not only for inviting to Islam, but from learning from one another, but to coexist with others. And this doesn't actually consist with hate speech. The concept of friendship and love in many Islamic texts highlighted. So, and hate speech often raises hostility and atrocity, anger, and so on. Common good. There is no doubt that Islamic teachings insist common good, and the idea of common good is contradictory with the idea of and the issue of hate speech, because when hate speech is spread, we hardly can develop common good. Also, tolerance or mudarat and moderation. Unfortunately, I have no too much time, but I am with Kafi Khomeini, who died in 328 or 29, and in 2 chapters, one after another, he talks first about Babul Mudarat and Babul Ref, and put together something like 22 hadiths. Of them are reliable and authentic hadiths. If we are nowadays under the influence of human rights and or Kant, but I think Khomeini was not. But there were a huge amount of texts insisting mudarat and rifq, which made him to dedicate 2 chapters to these 2 valuable items. And then, of course, we have the issue of dignity and respect to others. And we are quite sure that hate speech is against respect to others and their dignities in at least some cases. Yes, in our traditional view, some examples of hate speech is recognized and even considered as punishable. Of them is insulting prophets, their relatives, and other infallibles in Shiite view, and also insulting holy entities like Meccan and Medinan shrine, noble Quran, mosque, and any sacred items. We have it. And the qaida, the rule of al-ihana ila al-muqaddasat, is known as a rule. We know it. And so generally speaking, hate speech to this extent is prohibited. But we are in a dire need of rethinking, revising, and rewriting the concept of الإهانة إلى المقدسات or وجوب الاحترام إلى المقدسات الدينية, because we are living in an age of communication, in the light of technology and digital age. We are nowadays facing with the diverse communities, despite the united and non-diverse ancient societies. To make a good framework for determining the domain of hate speech, we are to rely upon some basic and major issues. Of them, of course, is justice and fairness. It is not right to request and ask others to respect your holy entities, but you don't respect their sacred entities and issues. We have to separate criticism from denigration and defamation. We have to treat equally with holy and sacred issues of different communities within Muslim community and human community at large. We have to be careful not to make people fed up and disgusted with Islam through making unnecessary and unreasonable restrictions under the umbrella of defending holy and sacred items and entities. And in case of doubt, I think we have to return back to the freedom and liberty and permissibility themselves. Yes, in some cases, for a Muslim alone, it might be recommended to observe, the principle of precaution and ihtiyat. I wanted to actually end my presentation with this novel verse. All of you are familiar with this verse, but I just want to learn from this Quranic verse some basic points. We all know that idolatry and idol worship is among the most prohibited behaviors or ideas. However, according to Quran, it is tolerable. Then the practical consequence of inviting people to the God should be taken into the account, and it has influenced upon permissibility or impermissibility of the action. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ زَيَّنَّا لِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ عَمَلَهُم, which means people are to some extent excused in their prejudice and bias and so on. And according to the rest of the Holy Ayah, the final judgment on the people should be left to God the Almighty in the hereafter. Thank you, my dear professors and scholars, for your patience and attention. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin.